Welcome back, AP. All right, we got a lot of stuff to go over today, so I'm sorry if this one's going to be a little bit longer than normal, but you know what? It's an AP class. It is what it is. And plus, I'm going to tell you some gross stories today. It's really hard. But anyway, let's pick it up, all right? So, where we're going with this today, we're going to pick up on like the Protestant ideas. We're going to talk about how Protestants don't necessarily agree with one another, the different types, the Radical Reformation, the German Peasants' War, Charles V trying to get everything calmed the heck down. But let's get after it, all right? So we talked about in class like iconoclasm, the Protestants and the Catholics disagreeing with one another, right? We talked about how Protestant thought can be broken down into much simpler chunks, okay? So big Protestant ideas going forward, though, again, is that God initiates salvation, not people. We talked about why that goes against Catholic Church in class. We talked about the authority of the church lies only in the Bible, that Eucharist and baptisms are ceremonies that do not necessarily have to be conducted they can be conducted by lay people, and they're important, but they're not dependent on a church official, right? So, and that the church lies, Number 2, quick correction from class as well. Upon further research and other things like that, the Eucharist and the baptism have to happen, particularly with the baptism happening, according to Protestants, still in infancy, right? So the Protestants still believe in infant baptism, much like the Catholics did, right? So the only things required of priests are the Eucharist and the baptism. Otherwise, your regular everyday life is on you, right? So the church lies in every believer, not in physical locations. We talked about that. And then here's the last one that we haven't talked about yet. Every person has a calling, all right? So according to Protestant thought, every person has a calling, and that means that no one is necessarily better than any other. And the way I use that is the monasticism idea, that just because you devoted yourself to a monastery does not mean that you are necessarily better and endowed to more rights than other people under the eyes of God, right? That's a big Protestant idea. So, going forward, though, did Protestants agree on everything? No, they did not. Do not listen to that noise. The Transubstantiation dispute is a big one, right? So, for example, we got 3 different types of people we've talked about up to this point. We got Catholics, we have Lutherans, and then we got the ideas of Zwingli and the Swiss Confederacy, right? So, Catholics, after the priest consecrates the bread and the wine, it becomes Christ. According to Luther, Christ is present in the Eucharist, but because of God, not because of the priests. And according to Zwingli, Christ isn't present in the bread and wine at all, but amongst us spiritually in the practice of, right? Zwingli was saying the practice is still very important, but he doesn't necessarily turn into bread and blood. You understand? So Lutherans still believe in loosely believe in transubstantiation, where Catholics completely believe in it, and Zwingli and Protestants of the Swiss Confederacy do not necessarily at all, right? So, continuing forward, though, as well, the appeal of Protestantism, right? Now, we got to talk about why so many people jumped on board with Protestantism. The big myth of Protestant ideas, everybody says that, oh, Luther got so much traction because Protestantism appealed so much to the poor people at the time. This is simply a myth, right? Due to the fact that by 1650, people of all classes had begun to reject Catholic thought, right? And to rebel against the church. So, going forward, though, the appeal actually lies in the fact that Protestants think that it is easier, or Protestantism is easier and a lot less complicated than that of, Catholic thought. And also, when your educational standards at the time were not as widespread as they are today, of course, simpler ideas are going to appeal to more people, right? Less ceremony is a big appeal of Protestant thought to Europeans at the time, right? So less ceremony, not necessarily needing confession, not necessarily needing Eucharist all the time, not necessarily needing much more about the faith-based, the faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone ideas appeal to people because it's more of their personal relationship with God, right? That's the big thing. It kind of puts more onus on the person and less on the community aspect of Catholicism, right? Whereas, I don't know, I kind of like the community aspect of Catholicism personally. Now, vernacular Bibles is a big reason why the Protestant idea spread so quickly as well. Read it on your own. That actually was a really, really big thing that turned a lot of Catholic monks into Protestant priests, right? So, Clergy should pay taxes was a big appeal of Protestant thought. A lot of people, including German princes and people in the HRE, loved that at the time because that meant that now, civically, some of these clergymen are going to be responsible to participate in society, right? Another big thing, pictures in the printing press, right? Vernacular Bibles that were printed by Protestants actually had pictures inside of them, right? So whereas the Catholic old scripts were written by hand by monks in Latin and had limited pictures, if any at all, right? So whereas the printing press, especially the big printing press hubs that were inside of Germany at the time, or the HRE, if you will, the Holy Roman Empire had the most printing presses, right? So like people like Albrecht Dürer began to actually engrave on his woodcuts. This is where a little bit of Renaissance Reformation overlap, right? Albrecht Dürer began to make those engravings, like the rhinoceros, or he did one on the four horsemen, right? The apocalypse and stuff like that. And they actually put pictures into Bibles, which actually was a big appeal to a lot of people. Here's another big one, the Protestant work ethic, which is why the American economy functions the way that it does. Thank you, Protestant work ethic. So the Protestant work ethic is the idea, and it's a really big reason why Europeans think Americans work too hard, right? So according to the Protestant work ethic, work sets someone free, right? Like the idea of specializing in a craft brings you closer to God. That working hard brings you closer to God. That like owning up and being a part of your community brings you closer to God. That not sitting on a throne and decreeing things, but actually working with your hands and making the best version of yourself and the best version of your trade, right? Protestant work ethic. Think about the people that founded the United States, right? Quakers, Protestants, hard workers, grain farmers, breadbasket of America. Southern colonies, Protestants, joint stock colonies, plantation economy, agriculture-centered, work hard, make food for everyone. New England colonies, Puritans, build boat, go fish, make things happen, right? Like, that is the American ideals, right? Protestant work ethic. It pushes the idea of hard work. That's a big thing. So, Luther's ideas actually appealed to so many people that German princes in the Holy Roman Emperor actually hid him and protected him. Underneath this thing, real quick, I know we're a long ways off from it. I know some of you are like, why is it so confusing sometimes, AP European history? Because it's much more of like a, European history is a lot more like the bricks in a wall, right? A brick in a wall, as in they build onto each other, yes, but they don't necessarily need to go in any specific order. They overlap. They come back. They reference back. They reference forward. They do like for example, like looking at that wall over there, right? Every brick has a different layer, area, like it overlaps, it comes back, it does all these things. Speaking of that building process, the Diet of Worms, right? The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, calls that meeting, says, Luther, you need to shut your mouth and say that you didn't actually mean that stuff. And he's like, I can't do it because God says I have a conscience. Eat it, Charles. So what Charles ended up doing is he actually passed this thing called the Edict of Worms, right? E-D-I-C-T of Worms, right? It's a law and a passing of a bull that came out following that meeting that actually declared Martin Luther and his followers and people that harbor him like just as big of heretics as Luther himself, right? So that's what I'm getting at. The fact that Protestant ideas were so appealing to so many at the time that German princes, royals in the Holy Roman Empire actually hid him and protected him from the persecution of Charles V. That is insane. So that's kind of how that went against the Edict of Worms, right? So just have Edict of Worms somewhere in there, right? Made Luther an outlaw. Big, big controversy, right? So continuing forward, though. Peasant Wars. It got bad. It got real bad. Now, really, really quickly, something about the Peasant Wars. Something about, I'm a part of a different part of revisionist history. There's a lot of revisionist historians out there these days that are kind of going back and looking at things and saying that maybe it wasn't as simple as we thought it was, right? The Peasant Wars started during 1525, right? So the Reformation had been rolling along. Luther is hiding. He's trying to stay away from the Pope. Leo X wants him dead, right? Like he wants him to like stand trial for his crimes, confess his negativities to God, and probably be tortured and burned at the stake, right? So something went down, though. Because of this religious fervor inside of all of Europe, a a lot of people began to relate Protestantism, the rise of that, directly over to just like saying it was causing revolts, right? A lot of Catholic rulers were like, oh, like look at what Protestantism is doing. Peasants are revolting. They're freaking out because their crops are dying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to get to a story here in a minute to kind of show you that peasant revolts have been happening for a long time. They're not necessarily completely linked together, but maybe they just kind of rubbed up against each other, and maybe one half of it used the other half to try and justify their means, right? So peasants were outraged over crop failures, right? And also rising rent that was going on. So a lot of like European historians believe that peasantry was beginning to divide itself and a growing middle class was popping up, right? This bourgeoisie class, wealthier peasants were beginning to rise up, and they saw a sliver of hope in the distance, like maybe if we can dispose some of these Catholic leaders of our areas, we'll have a little bit better of a chance of rising up a little bit, right? So a lot of them gravitated towards the idea of Protestantism, right? And so when the peasants were outraged over these crop failures and rising rent and the inability to actually be economically viable, they began to turn to the practices of Luther and being like, it doesn't look, the scripture says, the Bible says that we have a right to stand up for ourselves. And Luther originally supported them, but when an actual violent rebellion broke out, Luther submitted a pamphlet saying the worst thing you can do to smack God in the face is to actually have a rebellion because you're being so violent, right? You are going out and killing people. That is not necessary. So he actually spoke down about this rebellion, right? So you can see that they're not necessarily perfectly lined up, that like originally Luther was like, yes, I support you, we should actually ask for more, but when a violent rebellion broke out, Luther was like, oh crap, this is not good, right? So Peasant Wars began to break out during this time period of the later the Reformation, when it's like really, really churning forward. Peasants cited scripture as their justification. At the end of the entire thing, 75,000 peasants killed when nobles crushed this rebellion. And like I said, though, they're related, but they're not causationally related. If the Reformation didn't happen, then the peasants' rebellions probably would have happened regardless. But it's really interesting to look at the German Peasants' War of 1525, showing that people are beginning to kind of grab at religious instability to try and justify their rebellions, right? Because one had actually happened in 1517, quite a bit earlier, in Transylvania, in a kingdom of Hungary, right? This guy, Doza, all right? That is not how you pronounce his name, but I don't know how to speak Hungarian, so I'll probably go ask Miss Moretti later on. But he actually had a peasant rebellion that blew up in 1517, right? I think it was something around the range of 20,000 people were executed, but his entire rebellion blew up because of the same types of things. Nobles overreaching, charging more for rent because peasants were making a little bit more money, right? So they were like, oh, you ever heard of the problem of gentrification, right? It's a big political hot button issue. It's kind of not necessarily one side of the aisle says it's terrible, the other side of the aisle says it's natural economic policy, and in all reality, it's a little bit of both, you know what I mean? Because, real estate agents are going to make money. It's the point, right? You're supposed to go out there and make money. If you can have the chance to buy a house and flip it, you're going to make money, and if a business comes in that actually makes it rent a little higher, it's natural. But at the same time, shouldn't force people out or rip them off for their home values, right? So that was what was happening here. So the peasants were making a little extra money, so the nobles were like, oh, so we'll charge you more for rent. So Doza leads a peasants' revolt in Transylvania. And this is completely non-religiously motivated, right? So these things were going to happen. It's just interesting that the Peasants' War of 1525 actually was much more like a religious reach. You know what I mean? So really quickly, though, cool story. Doza, the guy that led the thing, actually was captured later on with a lot of his compatriots. And most of them were killed. But they decided to execute Doza in a very specific way. Because the nobles accused him of trying to have an uprising and make himself king. They built for him an iron throne, an iron crown, and an iron scepter. And they set them on fire. And they heated them until they were red hot. And then they forced Doza to sit in them, or sit on it, chained him to it, and then put the hot crown on his head, and then forced him to hold the scepter. And as he was burning alive, they marched 9 of his fellow rebellers in front of him, one being his brother, and he actually begged that his brother be spared. He's like, please spare my brother. And so they're like, all right, fine. And so they cut him into 3 pieces, right? You see parts of him down here. So they cut him into 3 pieces, and then the other 8 that were left, they said, here's what's going to happen. We're going to cut his skin open, and we're going to peel it back, and you are going to take bites of him and swallow it, and then we will let you live. And so as he is sitting there dying and searing and cooking on this iron throne, 4 of them refused. They are then also cut into 3 pieces, and then the other 4 that were left over actually did it. They bit parts of him off, and they consumed it, and then they were let go. So that is a crazy thing that's been going on in Europe before the Reformation, right? So what I'm trying to get at with this violent uprising stuff is the fact that the next thing that we're talking about isn't so surprising, right? So, oh, man, that doesn't really flow very well. Hold on one second. Let me check something. Did I skip something on accident? Yeah, weird. All right, anyway, sorry about that. We'll get to the marriage and sexuality thing of Protestants in about 2 seconds. So the thing got all out of order when I clicked on that picture. So ignore that. The spectrum drawed on board. Then this happened, okay? The Radical Reformation. This happened on the heels of the German Peasants' War, right? So funny enough, the fact that, like I said, they weren't causationally occurring, but the Peasants' War did have a huge place. So Radical Reformation, right? The Radical Reformation. The Radical Reformation is when these people called radicals began to denounce Luther and the fact that he did not back that Peasants' War like they wanted him to, right? Then Luther spoke out against the rebellions. He was like, you know, you going out and killing people is flying in the face of God. The radicals broke away and they were like, no, this is ridiculous. We don't even agree with Luther anymore because there's one big thing we disagree with him on. The big disagreement of all of the radicals at the time is on baptism. Radical reformers, mostly known as Anabaptists, believe in adult baptism. They believe that Baptists are, those are your Baptists, right? Modern day Baptists, Southern Baptists, what I was raised in when I was a kid, they believe that a person confesses their sins at around the age of like 14, 15, 16, or whenever. You can do it when you're 45, doesn't matter. And then when you accept Christ into your heart, you were then baptized, right? Well, Lutherans and Catholics and even Zwingli himself believed in infant baptism, right? And due to the fact that Justinian in the Byzantine Empire actually said that there is no such thing as rebaptism, and that is a heretical, like an act of heresy, that you could actually be punished for it. The Anabaptists hopped up and they were like, hey, you know, we don't believe in that. We believe in, like, the apocalypse is coming any day now. We believe that God is watching you. We believe that you are closer to hell than you are to heaven, and we believe that you should get baptized later in life. The entirety of Europe freaked out. Protestants freaked out and persecuted them. The Catholics freaked out and persecuted them. Their persecution was brutal. It was awful. So, like, radicals included Anabaptists, Mennonites, Hutterites, the Amish. You know these people already, right? And the reason why they never got as big, quite as big as like most other factions did in the Protestant Reformation, like they didn't get any political backing. You understand what I'm saying? So like Anabaptists and radical reformers believe that the government and the church should be completely intertwined, one unit, right? Whereas Protestants and Catholics were doing like this, and they were kind of separating the two and realizing that church and state should be separate, right? So the Anabaptists are the Handmaid's Tale fans. Any Handmaid's Tale fans? Yeah, the nation of Gilead would be like an Anabaptist like dream, right? So anyway, but continuing forward, the Anabaptists were heavily persecuted, and they were pushed out mainly. Write this down real quick. They were pushed to colonize a lot of parts of North America because they were escaping persecution. So a lot of people, when you're in 5th grade and they're like, and your teacher was like, okay, students, why was North America colonized by the Europeans? And they usually, you raise your hand, you're like, religious freedom. And that's like the only thing they ever told you, right? That actually applies more to Anabaptists of the middle colonies than it does to the northern separatist Puritans than it does anyone else. And this is due to the fact that like other subgroups of these people are like Quakers and Baptists. So anyway, like jot that down. But like this is a big one. This is one of the very first martyrs of the Anabaptist faith. He's actually a Swiss preacher, and he was actually executed by Zwingli and by supporters of Zwingli. They tied him to a ladder and then pushed him into a bonfire. Right. So like another one actually in France was like executed for heresy by Ferdinand II, King Ferdinand, and he said, "Oh yeah, you think you believe in a second baptism? Well, guess what? Here's your third baptism." And he said a third baptism is the cure for Anabaptists, and they drown him. Like, so, like, that is messed up. I know for a fact Jules Barrett and Denny Kelly right now are going, ha, 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 because it is kind of funny a little bit in retrospect. But, like, right here, this is also, these are Catholics actually burning them at the stake, using a pitchfork to remove the body so they can put more Anabaptists on there to actually persecute them and execute them. Those are your radical reformers, right? Not accepted whatsoever by many, many religious authorities, right? So now, other couple things we got to talk about real fast before we actually stop for the weekend is marriage and sexuality in the Protestant communities, right? So the one big things that they believe in is most Protestants believe celibacy vows go against human nature, right? So Protestant priests were actually allowed to get married. Protestant pastor wives, though, were actually held to a ridiculously high standard. Okay, so for example, Martin Luther's wife was raised to a crazy high standard. They had to be the model of Protestant women. Like, they had to do this, do that, be the toe the line as a Protestant woman, which actually was also at the time very, very sexist towards ideals and like what their role was in the house and things like that. However, they did allow them to get married. Protestants preached the greatness of marriage against the lust of society. So they wanted their priests to get married as well because they believed that the celibacy vows of the Catholic Church during the Renaissance and pre-Renaissance eras are one of the reasons why all the corruption actually happened, right? So Protestants still believe, though, that women, like I said, were subordinate. However, many women still supported Protestantism despite those beliefs, right? Because it did mean that they could actually further their place in society by marrying Protestant priests due to the fact that Protestant priests still had a higher elected position within their communities, right? So Protestants did allow divorce and remarriage too, though. That's a big, big thing. Put a star next to that. That's where Henry VIII is going to see that and be like, ha, 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 and he's going to start freaking out, right? So last couple things is sexuality. Protestants, however, fervently condemned a couple of things, including prostitution. That's a big one. A lot of brothels were actually closed down, and they denounced the whoredom. Was used by reformers to denounce prostitute actions. Big blitz in Germany to close brothels was huge. That the Catholics had actually allowed to exist for a very long time because prostitution was legal in Europe during the Middle Ages, pre-Middle Ages, the Romans. It was very, very legal. Protestants believed that the quick turn from society was like, we got to cut this off, destroy that, right? And they actually closed down a lot of brothels in the areas. So what we're going to do, though, is we're going to talk about the political state of the German states in class, because there's no way that I'm going to be able to keep your attention for this. All right, so we're going to pick back up on this on Monday, and we're going to get into Henry VIII. We're going to get into Henry VIII on Monday as well. Very excited. I'll see y'all then. Have a great weekend.